Aloha, friends. I'm really not sure that I deserve such an honor to introduce Dr. John Hatcher, but I believe that my father had something to do with that. You know, he's currently in the Bahá'í Kingdom for about 2.5 years, and Dr. John Hatcher is someone that my father always held in the highest esteem, had a lot of love and respect for him. And I feel really, really proud and honored to have this privilege. And as mentioned, I haven't done anything to deserve this honor, but I'm grateful to the committee for allowing me to do so. Dr. John S. Hatcher is a professor emeritus at the University of Florida, where he taught in the English department for 39 years and headed graduate studies in English literature. An author and speaker, Professor Hatcher has published poems, articles, and over 25 books, some of which have been translated into Spanish, French, German, and Chinese. He presently serves as editor of journal Bahá'í Studies and is also part of a team translating Bahá'í text from Persian and Arabic into English. He has served the Bahá'í faith in various administrative capacities and has spoken on the Bahá'í faith at such universities as Oxford, McGill, Emory, the University of Maryland, and the University of Michigan. He presently has 4 books on the Bahá'í faith contracted for future publication. A man that needs no introduction, Dr. John Hatcher.
Should we test this thing now? There we go. Okay. Let's get this over. Okay, can we switch on the PowerPoint? Yeah, is that it? Yeah, that's it. Okay, friends, a couple of things to say. Is this a little too loud? Or y'all judge that? The first thing I'd like to say is how great it is to be here with Ken. We were together a few weeks ago at the National Convention, and last year at my convention report, the friends said, "This was the best convention report you've ever given." And then I heard a couple of days ago from some people here, you know, that was the best, that was better. And what they don't realize is the conventions get better and better. And so this year we elected Kevin Trotter, a young Hispanic male, which made our dearly beloved NSA now be constituted by, let me see if I can get it. I'll get the 2 white males out of the way first. A Persian male, a Persian female, the first one elected to the NSA ever, a Native American female, an African American female, an African American male, and now with Kevin Trotter, a Hispanic. So we've got and that's by this mysterious electoral process that Baha'u'llah has established. And it's amazing. You couldn't contrive to get a more representative and beautiful NSA. But the main thing is that I've been a delegate for far too long, and but it has enabled me to get a historical perspective of the evolution of this institution of the convention. And it is so beautiful. It is like this, a family gathering now. And we love our NSA. I remember a talk several years ago by former House of Justice member Peter Kahn, and he said, you know, how many groups would say, you know, I love my city council. I love the Senate, you know, or I love the Congress. But in this faith, I always wish that members of some political entity or group, it happened once, could see the convention take place and see what a marvel it is, the electoral process and the intelligent conversation that goes on. It's incredible. But at any rate, so I'm very proud to be here with the person who is largely in charge of being sure the machine stays well oiled and runs smoothly. He's a wonderful person and much beloved by all of the members of the NSA and all of the delegates and of the community worldwide. We're doing something to complement each other. I'm going to start off with some nitty-gritty stuff, and then he's going to back off and get a broader sense of knowledge, which leads to love, which leads to justice in both the individual and collective sense, where we're going to deal with nitty things like what is sin anyway, and how do we get rid of it, and what is salvation from a Baha'i point of view. One interesting thing about being here is that the last time I was here, I wasn't in this facility, I was across the lake at the Methodist Youth Camp. I was head of the Florida Baha'i School Committee. This was 1971, 44 years ago. It's not that long ago. And Robert Fuller and Irma Fuller were on the committee with me. You may remember them, some of you. And we had cabins, but really good food. But I was raised a Methodist, and so I feel very comfortable in any Methodist facility, because I think the Methodist Church prepared me to accept Baha'u'llah. It was not dogmatic, and there were very open discussions we had about various difficult theological matters. I remember in my junior youth class, or youth class in the Methodist Church saying, if a Nazi, this was to the teacher, if a Nazi really believed in what he was fighting for, standing for, deep in his heart, is he still committing a sin? You know, this is the kind of discussion we had, you know, and the answer was very profound, actually. The answer that the youth leader gave me was, he may not be sinful until he has some inkling that he's doing something wrong, but he's still contributing to the pot of sin. He's still contributing to negativity in the world. So what we're going to look at first thing is what is evil and what is sin. And we're going to go back to 1960s. I'm very romantic and reminisce a lot. 1960s, something came up that seemed very profound and earth-shaking at the time, called situational morality. Now we would call it relativism. But the idea of situational morality is you cannot really assess someone's moral character on the basis of an action until you know all of the circumstance under which that action was committed. And the idea was, obviously, that if you understood that, then you would be able to assess that. Now, it relates to a very important Baha'i axiom, and I'm going to be throwing the word axiom a lot, because what we're going to be doing is, in all of these questions, you may think it's strange that both teachers have given you already what the workshops are going to be and what the course is going to be. So how neat is that? You can look up the answers in your free time you have and come to the workshops and shine, if you can find the answers. Of course, the answers have to be based on the writings. And one of the things in the writings says that one of the axioms is that we cannot judge another person. And another axiom that I would throw at you is you cannot judge yourself. You don't have enough information about yourself. You can't objectively look at all the variables that have gone into your life. So you may think you're failing miserably, but perhaps from God's point of view, in terms of all the troubles and tribulations and tests you had, you're doing very well. You know? But you certainly can't judge anybody else. Which means, how do we know someone's sinning? How do we know we're sinning? Hey, Gregory. All right. From sin to salvation. Let's begin with a case of situational morality. Now, this is a situation where you seem to have a mean dog, a retreating dog, and a pacifist dog. The poodle is the pacifist, and the smooth collie is the one bearing her teeth. And Lucia, what's the other dog's name? Barney? Archie. Archie, the greyhound, is saying, "Whoa, I think I may have bit off more than I can chew," quite literally. And so you say, is this a good dog or a bad dog? Who's doing the right thing here? Well, I know the situation, so I can tell you who's the sinful dog and who's the heroine. And of course, the pacifist is obvious. That's Luigi, the poodle, drinking dirt water in the back. Now, you might think that Molly, the smooth collie, which was our dog, is mean. Look at those teeth. You wouldn't want those teeth coming at you. But what you don't realize, if you look carefully, you can see she's doing a 180 in the air. En l'air, how do you say it? Tourjete, in area. She's actually, Archie is a mean dog. And Archie has been running all over the dog park, knocking all the other dogs down. And chasing Molly. Molly loved to be chased because she could outrun and outcut any dog there was. Even the greyhound, she couldn't outrun him, but she could outcut him. But she was tired. She just had enough of being bumped around by this dog. And so she ultimately, as you can see, Archie had been chasing her. She jumped up in the air, did a 180, and came down with her mouth like that, and Archie went, ooh, whoa. Okay. So, Archie is the sinful dog, and Molly is the heroine, and Luigi is just shocked and stunned. Now, can there be a good dog and a bad dog? Is there such thing as a bad dog? Gregory, be quiet. I'm asking you. We're going to have more discussion than we are a lecture here. Anybody, can there be a bad dog? Yes? All right. No. Who says no? Okay, why not? So she says a dog reflects what it is trained, and therefore it is neither good nor bad. Yes.
I think you have to define what's bad. You mean it's a sinful dog? No. You have to recognize that this dog is intentional. Dog uses bad traits in relation to its trained or not trained. It's bad. In other words, it's trained to fight, and like a dog fight. That would be bad.
Okay, so
It would be bad for other dogs, but it would actually be good for the owner because it's trained to do that.
all right. So what she said, and I have to repeat things for the recording because you don't have mics. What she said was that the dog may do bad things according to how it's been trained, but it's not responsible for committing a sin. Well, we could discuss this for about an hour, but we're not. The fact is that a dog can't sin. Yes, you were right, all right? I'd give you a star, but I didn't bring my stars. All right. Why can't a dog sin? What is in the nature of the word and the concept of sin that makes it impossible for anything but a human being to sin? Yes. The dog has no soul. Oh, poor dog. It's got no soul.
You have to recognize the good and the bad.
You have to recognize good and bad, which are concepts, abstractions. All right? So an animal can be loving. It can emulate all kinds of human attributes, which are spiritual attributes. And the more they are exposed to us, if we are spiritual ourselves, the more they will emulate our attributes in the same way that we become more spiritual, the more we emulate the higher expression of ourselves, which is the manifestation, or a person more spiritual than we are. So they can imitate or emulate and express love. I'm sure all of you have seen on the social media these dogs responding when their owner or master or friend comes back from the service, and there was one, this big black retriever, I think, that jumps in his lap and literally starts crying. And you think, you can't tell me that dog doesn't have a soul. Well, they have a spirit. They have a spirit. And what that spirit is capable of, we don't know yet. But very advanced development in terms of its capacity. It will never become human. But then we'll never become a manifestation. So, sin then is something that requires a concept of abstract notions of morality. And so the dog can say, oh boy, I'm going to get it now because I was on the sofa, and they're going to put their hands on the sofa to see if it's warm, and once they feel that, I'm going to get it. Or they're going to see the dog hair, and that'll be just as bad, and I'll get yelled at or get a scowl, and I don't like that because it feels bad. You know, and you could say anything to the dog, and if the inflection was right, it would be happy, and if the inflection was wrong, it would be sad. So, you know, you could say, good dog. You know, and the dog would cower. The essence of the human morality, or the engine of self, is the soul. But what is the soul? So our capacity to understand abstraction emanates from the powers of what makes us distinct, our soul. Now the dog or any other animal may not have a soul per se, they have a spirit, they have some spiritual attributes. So when we say, do the dogs go to heaven, and Abdul Baha said to the little lady, if you need the dog, he'll be there. We all know that story. If you don't, I'll tell you later, but that's about it. Our rational soul, as Abdul Baha sometimes calls it, in some answer, he uses various terms, and so does Baha'u'llah. The rational soul, the capacity for reason, and so on. He, in one place, says there are 5 constituent parts of the spiritual self and 5 components of the physical self, the 5 senses, and then the soul. He has imagination and so on. And then he lists them otherwise and with other terms in other places. But what exactly is the soul? And from whence cometh the soul? The soul emanates from the spiritual realm during conception. So what is the point of our beginning? Now, some Baha'i, you may think, well, this is simple stuff. This is what we teach our children. It is. That's what's so wonderful about the faith, is your child can learn all of these axioms quite as well as you can, maybe not on the same level or the same application. But that's what's wonderful, is its logic. And children are inherently logical until you teach it out of them. Okay, and you teach them prejudices and biases and so on. But if you let them and nurture it, they'll be supremely logical. I remember one time at a school, and we'll get to this later, this point, this axiom. I was talking to my niece, whose daughter was there at the school, and she was only 13, but she wanted to go to the adult class, so her mother let her. And so we were talking before the class and said, when did human beings begin in creation? And this is something else we're going to get to, the point where God decides to create human beings. And of course, you're all familiar with the hadith that says, I was alone, I wished to be known, therefore I brought creation into being that I might be known. And of course, it's paraphrased in several hidden words. I love thy creation, hence I created thee, and so on. And so I said, well, let's get Michelle here, and I'll show you how it works. And I said, Michelle's the 13-year-old, I said, how long has God existed? And she said, forever. I said, what is God's will? What does he wish to do? And she said, create people. And she knew to know and to worship him, because she knew the prayer, the noonday prayer already. She was a fairly intelligent, advanced child, and still is. She's at the University of British Columbia right now. And I said, so when did God begin creating human beings? He said, forever. Why did she say that? Because there's nothing else she could say. Because it's logical. There's no other deduction you can have. If God has existed forever, and if his desire is to create beings capable of knowing and loving him, then when did he start this? When did he suddenly say, I know what? I feel alone. Now, he's existed forever, and suddenly he, at one point in forever, decides that I feel lonely. Of course, we don't mean he's lonely any more than... well, we'll get to that later. So the soul emanates from God, we're told. We emanate from God. So do we pre-exist? Nobody wants to answer that one. Yes, we don't. The writings say very clearly there is no pre-existence, that our identity begins at the point where the soul associates with the body at conception. Now, I can show you writings later where it says it very specifically, but not in any form do we exist. There's no soup of souls, and we are part of the soup, and we go back to the soup. It doesn't say that. We have our identity beginning at that point, and we retain our identity throughout the worlds of God. Period. That's an axiom. You don't have to take my word for it. You have access to the same writings I do, and nothing I say intentionally distorts the writings. I may make wrong inferences, and I may make wrong deductions, but the writings that they take these things from other writings that you have access to. So we got one problem left here. When is conception? Well, it's not at the point of help me, Lucia. Huh? It's not at the point of fertilization. Thank you, Lucia. Lucia is actually the one who knows all this stuff, and she just guides me, you know. No, actually, she's lived with me so long that she's heard me say everything I've ever thought of. And she also edits my books. Conception is a process. There is no point. You have fertilization, but then if you have twins, they may not separate for a couple of days or more. So when is the point at which the soul associates? Well, the answer is we don't know, but somewhere in that point, some point in that process. So That's the beginning of us. Abdu'l-Baha says our individuality, our personality is from the beginning. So this goes against all of the 20th century, mid-20th century, early 20th century psychology that said we are a part of all we have met. Well, we are a part of all we have met, but we aren't constituted of, we're not simply a product of external forces. Our personality, our special qualities, us, that individuality that is you. There never has been someone like you. There never will be again. You are unique in all creation. You always will be, and you're stuck with yourself forever. Which is a good thing if you like yourself, and a depressing thing if you want to change yourself, because it means you might as well start now to enjoy the benefits of being stuck with yourself forever. The spirit emanates from the soul, as do all other distinctive human powers. Now, I don't want to get into a distinction of what is the difference between the spirit and the powers. That gets largely semantic. Suffice it to say, everything that makes us distinctly human is a capacity that emanates from the soul, and that includes your reason, that includes your memory, your not imprint the kind that the elephant has, but the conceptual memory. And so, indeed, that will stay with you. And all of these things that you have as powers will stay with you forever. Your emotion. Now, why is that important? Because if you believe that motion is simply the result of neurotransmitters crossing the synaptic cleft in your brain, then when your brain is gone, that means you're not going to have emotion. But the brain is not the source of emotion. It is a transmitter of emotion. The soul feels and transmits it to the brain so that you can feel it while you're associating with the body and others can see what you're feeling as well. So, free will. Will is a part, a power of the soul. Everything that's distinctively human about us, that distinguishes us from Molly, as good and noble as Molly was. She's gone on to doggy heaven now. But her spirit still lingers. You know, those of you who love animals, you know what I mean. Right? So she lives on in our lives. She lives on and in what way, I don't know. But that's something we can ask when we cross over. Unless we cross down. So, the qualities, the powers that emanate from the soul, these include self-consciousness, reason, will, conceptual memory, emotion, love, meditation, very important one, meditation, we're going to get to that, judgment, and so on. The powers of the soul are unaffected by illness of mind or body. This is fairly close to a paraphrase. Well, it is a paraphrase of what Baha'u'llah says in Gleanings. And this is incredibly important because that means if you have a child that has a disability that is not fully formed, and this is something that I found comforts a lot of people who go through the really incredible amount of service and love of raising a child that is incomplete in some way, whether physically or mentally, or goes through some degenerative disease, or where you're a caregiver for an adult going through the same process. Their soul, their essential self, their personality is okay. In fact, it may be being strengthened by this stress in the same way that an athlete who is not stressed is no longer a good athlete. And so how long does the athlete keep up stressing himself or herself? Anybody? If you want, let's say you're training to compete in the 100-yard dash. When do you start training? Yesterday. And how long do you train? Every day, you know. And you don't get to some point and say, okay, that's enough. That's enough training. There's a balance, and a good coach discerns that. A good teacher knows how much to stress and how much to lay off. What is the balance between stress and so on? And so God, in stressing us with suffering, is training us. And so someone who has a disability, whether of mind or body, is being strengthened. And so once that association with the body no longer exists, that soul is now liberated from that dysfunctional intermediary, that is the brain body. And they may be incredibly stronger than someone who seemed to be valedictorian and everything else. This is not only comforting, it's very important, because each of us is going to go through a process I'll describe in just a second, where we are doomed for detachment. Of course, detachment is a positive thing in the faith. We want to become detached. But we're going to become detached whether we want to be or not. So long as the association between the soul and the body endures, our sense of self is largely dependent on a healthy, what I like to call a transparent brain. Now, what do I mean by that? That the brain is able to translate into or manifest into physical actions the intent and nature of your soul, your essential self. Okay? Not your insistent self. Well, hopefully not your insistent, but it'll translate that too. So in other words, as long as your brain is transparent, everything's working properly, what you see is what you get, and what you try to express is what will be understood. As long as that brain is transparent. Now, if you through Alzheimer's or some traumatic injury, it can no longer do that, then we can't understand what that soul is experiencing. And the soul itself can't either, in the sense that our consciousness, and that's one thing I didn't put down that's more important than any others, our consciousness is one of the powers. Our self-consciousness, our self-awareness is one of the powers of the brain, of the soul. And so because our own sense of self is caught up in this, very tightly in this associative relationship, even unless we have a near-death experience and we get away from that attachment, what we feel is what our body is telling us we're going through. And so that's why we can't even assess our own development. We can get to more of that later. And incidentally, a lot of what I'm telling you is described very beautifully in a three-part talk that I'm sure a lot of you have heard called The Immortality of the Soul by Hooper Dunbar, which is doing very well on YouTube. I strongly recommend it. He does some really nice stuff on that, particularly when we get to the afterlife. Our awareness of our body is not acquired. Now, this is kind of an incidental axiom, but it's worth knowing. I know my hand's out here because of my kinetic receptors, kinesthetic receptors, but I'm aware of my body, and in fact, of course, when I'm young, my body is me. Now that I'm older, my body is something I'm dragging around, all right? And sometimes not very successfully. Now, why is that? Abdu'l-Baha explains this. He says, our awareness of our body is not acquired because the spirit surrounds the body. What does he mean by that? Well, I don't know, because the spirit's not physical, so how can it have a physical parameter? I don't know, but he says it. But he says it, interestingly, not to explain the nature of the soul, but to explain the fact that the manifestations are ontologically on a different level than we are. They're a different kind of being. They're not just advanced human beings. Because he goes on to say the manifestation, the spirit of the manifestation, surrounds reality itself. And therefore they are aware of everything. Isn't that interesting? So here are some quotes that sort of back up some of the things we've said. The foremost degree of comprehension in the world of nature is that of the rational soul. This power and comprehension is shared in common by all men, whether they be heedless or aware, wayward or faithful. In the creation of God, the rational soul of man encompasses and is distinguished above all created things. It is by virtue of its nobility and distinction that it encompasses them all. In effect, the human soul is the highest form of creation in the physical world, other than the manifestation, of course. But the manifestation is, of course, not of this world. Manifestation, unlike us, pre-exists in the world of the spirit. So they're totally different beings from us. That's very important. A lot of Baha'is don't understand how important that is. That they aren't ordinary human beings. They aren't suddenly transformed from one form to another. We'll get to that. Now, this diagram, some of you may have seen before. I've used it before. I like to use the prism, and that's what that's meant to be, as an analogy to the brain. Because a prism, of course, takes pure white light and refracts it into the visible spectrum, and probably the invisible spectrum, but I can't see it, so I don't know it's there. But if I had a spectrograph, I could. And so the powers that we're talking about that emanate from the soul, the consciousness, ideation, reason, will, memory, love, imagination, emotion, and others. These are just some. The power of those is transmitted from the soul spiritually through the brain as an intermediary. And that's why I call the brain a transceiver. It is sending and receiving information back and forth to the soul. We see things in physical reality that are transmitted to our soul through our brain. And if we're blind, we're deprived of some of the visual information, and so on. So our senses enable us to transmit this to the soul, and the soul can consider it and think what to do about it. And so the end result is that what happens on this side happens on this side, and ideally what you want is transparency. You're never going to get pure transparency. You're never going to be, it's never totally accurate, but you want it as much as possible. And this is the passage that says that we have the inherent awareness of the body, and there's the particular phrase. For the spirit surrounds the body and is aware of its sensations and powers. Okay. These are just quotes so you can see that I wasn't making all this stuff up. But also so you can see that anything I know, you can know just as easily as I can by reading the same writings. Now here we get to something where we're getting a little more to, we've got to watch our time here because we haven't even dealt with, we've done with sin, but we're supposed to be dealing with guilt here too, and I think guilt is very important. I'm very fond of guilt. The paradigm for our life is sort of pre-designed. We have spiritual development, we have physical development, and hopefully they're kind of in sync for a while. So we have the cell dividing, and somewhere during that process of conception, we have the associative relationship, and you as an individual being, human being, begins its physical journey, or its spiritual journey too. So there's the spiritual journey we hope for. Okay, this kind of uninterrupted ascent. But we know it's really more jagged than that. But the physical is pretty predictable. The spiritual is not. The physical goes like that. All right? And the point there where they're right together is at about 19 to 21 years old. So that's the peak of your physical capacity. Now you may get in better shape when you're 40 than you were when you're 20, but the point is your capacity to be in shape was at its peak around 20. So no matter how good a shape you get in, you won't be as good a shape as you could have been in if you'd done the same exercises at 20. So in other words, we are doomed to decline. And so this is the force we're fighting against, is that declination, if there is such a word. It sounds good. I think it should be a word if it's not. So 40 years old, 50 years old, 60 years old, and then 70 years is, according to Psalms, as much time as we are generally allotted. And the rest of that I call borrowed time, because it means we're fortunate if we still have our wits about us and are still functioning and can contribute something. But it's very iffy that we're going to be able to do that. And that's the Psalm 90, verse 10. Now, detachment will occur, as you can see. I always like to think of these strands. You know, when you peel the rind off of an orange, how those little white things are there, and they snap, 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 snap. And you're sort of peeling away the outer bitter portion to get at the fruit. And that's what God is doing with this design. Here's the fruit, and here's the skin you're peeling away, and here are the little white things that suddenly snap. Okay? And when they snap, you have detachment. All right? And the final detachment, of course, is where we totally abandon the physical garment and that associative relationship. And Baha'u'llah says, in the twinkling of an eye, once that relationship between the rational soul and the body, and we are suddenly no longer the physical being, are associated with that. But we take all those powers with us. So in other words, basically you pick up where you leave off, and you take all of the things you've developed, including your memories of this world and everything, with you. So in one sense, what happens when you die is not a mystery if you have taken yourself to account each day. Because if you've done a fair job, you'll say, well, I know exactly where I am. And God will say, yes, but you forgot about this and this and this you did in the recounting when you do the final assessment. Now, here's where we get to something that I'm very fond of, and this is the guilt thing. What is guilt, and is it good or bad? Most psychologists, let me say not most psychologists, we've got an article coming out in the issue that's just coming out now of the Baha'i Studies Journal, the Journal of Baha'i Studies, with a lovely article by Michael Penn, who's a clinical psychologist and a wonderful scholar. And he's got an article about spirituality and psychology that will really set things straight. But there are a lot of psychologists who perceive religion as negative because it makes you feel bad. It makes you feel guilty. What does guilt derive from? Pardon? Shame is the result sometimes of guilt. Shame is more of a social phenomenon. Though you can feel shame without sharing it with others, but shame usually is abasement, a form of, I feel ashamed because people know that. But yeah, it's pretty synonymous, but it is a synonym. It doesn't explain it. What does guilt result from? Yes, ma'am. Pride? In what sense? How does it cause guilt? Speak a little louder, please. Pride could cause guilt, yes, but just in every instance, what is happening when you feel guilt? I got too many people at once. You had your hand up first. That's as simple as it gets. That's right. So pride may be one reason you would fall short of your expectations, but that's what causes guilt. You expect one thing of yourself and you perform another way, less than what you expect of yourself. That's one reason we take ourselves into account each day. Yes? We presume that knowledge of right and wrong is part of your expectation. But, again, it depends on what you are. If you're an athlete and your sole metric by which you assess your accomplishment is how well you did at the last track meet, I keep using track metaphors because that's what I did, then you would say, oh, I feel guilty because I didn't work hard enough or something. So it depends. In other words, right and wrong for a Baha'i would absolutely be the reason for guilt and probably the only reason. So we have a shared sense of moral standards in the faith. The rest of the world has lost any shared sense of moral standards. That is, shared in the sense that we agree on this, and this, and this. That's why it's so important that we have in the faith standards that derive not from a group of people deciding what is and is not appropriate, or any particular community or any particular nation saying, this is now acceptable, this is not acceptable, so on. Because you can't legislate morality. So it's so wonderful that we have from Baha'u'llah a very clear statement of virtues. And so when we teach children, we begin very early to teach them, here are axiomatic statements about what is good behavior and what is not so good behavior. What is the first thing you feel when you come to a Baha'i school? Baha'i schools, we were told long ago, are meant to emulate what the future Baha'i community will feel like. What is one of the first things you notice? Now, obviously, I have my idea of what I want to share with you, so I'm asking you to guess with it. But let me not do that. The first thing I feel when I come here is, I don't have to worry about anybody stealing my stuff. Now, that may sound like, pretty crass. You see the level I live at, right? But it's true. And, of course, it points to something in Book 1 of Rui, which says what? What? Thank you. Very good. And also about trustworthiness. Foundation of all other virtues. And it is. And if we could just have this trustworthiness we have among each other in the real world, wouldn't it be nice? And that's the first thing I noticed is, these are my friends. When Gracie was talking about my daughter, she didn't know who had Gregory. It was passed around from person to person. But we know Gregory's fine because everyone loves Gregory. Gregory's my youngest grandson. So, getting back to the axiom. Guilt is the relationship between your expectations and your performance. And these graphs here, I'm going to go through them all and then we'll go back. These graphs are showing desired pattern of action. In other words, if we could have it perfectly, we would, and you can see, my expectation is this solid line. So I expect to do here, and wow, I did it. I excelled above my expectation. But then it kind of tapers off, and so, okay, I take to myself into account at the end of the day, and tomorrow I'm going to do better. And by golly, I do. And this is what we are capable of doing. Of course, we can never achieve it because of the changes and chances of this life, the suffering we go through and so on, though we don't know that still might be going on. And that's why, again, you can't really judge yourself, let alone anyone else. That's why we need an infinite deity capable of taking into account all the variables in our lives. And so that our assessment, we're told that at the end of life, and we'll get to that later, that we'll be, of course, in the one where it says, take yourself into account each day, ere thou art called to a reckoning. Summoned to a reckoning? Summon. What? Summoned, thank you. You know it better than I do. Well, I don't know why I need to teach you anything. So, what does that mean? What is this summoning? Anybody? You don't know it as well as I thought. When are we summoned to a reckoning? When we die. We've told that in the writings over and over, that after you die, the first thing that's going to happen is you're going to do a life review assessment. I was talking at breakfast about this wonderful movie my wife and I like so much called Defending Your Life. Albert Brooks did this wonderful movie, and he goes, you go to Judgment City, and you do a life review, and a panel looks at it and decides whether you should go on in your spiritual evolution, or you need to go back to Earth and to try again. You know, of course, well, we don't believe in reincarnation. We do believe that we will be in a condition, and we'll get to that in session 3, but that we'll be in a condition appropriate to what we've achieved. So in other words, we do believe there is a relationship between how we perform in this life and what occurs to us both immediately as we begin the second part of our journey, or the third part. We've already lived in the womb life, the physical life, and now we're ready for the third eternal life. Now, this is a paradigm or a graph showing negligible progress, but always in touch with personal reality, a comfortable life. Okay? These are, of course, just fictional possibilities. So we see guys doing okay. I say a guy because I don't like to offend women. I don't mind offending guys. So here you're not making any progress, but you're doing okay. You're doing exactly the same prayer every day, exactly the same prayer in the morning. You're taking yourself to account each day, but you think you're doing okay. But you're not really, because you're not making progress. And so then you start to say your prayers in the morning, but not at night, or the other way around, yada, yada, yada. And then you say, wait a minute, I can do better than this. And so you have this progress. See, that's progress relative to beginning, relative to here or relative to here. Relative to here, it's really great. Wow, I'm doing great. But then, of course, we always fall off again. I always fall off again. So you can see how guilt works. Guilt is simply feedback. And you don't want to... The idea that guilt is bad is absurd. It is a message. If you feel like your foot is on fire, all right, you don't want to say, bad nerves, telling me my foot is on fire, you know? I don't want to know such things. That makes me feel bad about my foot. But if you look down and your foot is on fire, then you'll probably want to move your foot out of the fire or pour water on it. But if you look down and your foot is not on fire, then you go to the neurologist and say, the messenger is screwing up here. The same thing is true with your own sense of self. So if you go into a state of depression, and we've got a great article coming out on that by Abdul Masag Gadarian in the fall issue on depression, almost epidemic. Well, what is depression? Depression is where the neurotransmitters, the messengers, are giving you the wrong message. And so you need help in fixing that, so the brain is transparent again. And so here you see a situation where you really fall off in your performance, and that's enough to make anybody feel depressed, for sure. Oops. There. Where's the little... doobie here. Got a little button I can press. There it is, right there. All right, and then the guilt chart here, same thing. Slightly guilty, dissatisfied, pleased with ourselves, very guilty, normal day-to-day assessment, so on. You can see the various configurations. So guilt is a messenger telling us how we're doing, unless we feel it obsessively and inappropriately, in which case the messenger may be screwing up. You may need to change your diet, you may need to take SSRIs or have some counseling or whatever. So emotions are very important, right? They're very important messengers about how we're doing, and so is guilt. Now, sin. Sin then is what? Sin is a violation, of course, of some moral law, but there's this thing, and I'll probably mess it up too. I'm very bad at memorizing things exactly, but the good deeds of the faithful are sins to the near one, something like that. What do you interpret that to mean? Relative. Sin is relative. Now, it doesn't mean that the moral perspective of Baha'u'llah is relative, but it means the accomplishment of something is relative. So what was a good deed for you when you were an alcoholic, if you have been sober, then you are doing great. So in other words, if I have never had a problem with alcoholism and I go a day without alcohol, I haven't accomplished anything. But if I've been an alcoholic all my life and I go a day without alcohol, I've done very well. So this is why the problem when we take ourselves into account each day is we have to keep examining what our standards are in relation to what's possible for us to do. Okay? Now, if you look on your sheet, and as I say, it's wonderful that here we are, teachers, Ken and I, and we've already given you out the questions and the passages, and so, I mean, there's not much left for you to do, except that some of these are very hard, and you'll never get through all of them in our class. But let's look at some of them. The defining terms in Class 1, and then I have passages that relate to those, particularly dealing with the symbolic terms of Satan and sin and so on. And then the class workshop, which has questions that are similar to the terms that we are defining and based on a lot of what we've already said. So let's deal with some of them now. Let's look at the first page, Class 1, defining terms. Now, there's a passage by Abdu'l-Baha that says the following. Someone get Ken a sheet. He doesn't have one. You got one? You got some extra ones? Oh, all right. Anyone who doesn't have a sheet, get some. Abdu'l-Baha says that evil is essentially non-existent. What does that mean? Evil is essentially non-existent. Yes. I couldn't hear you. Okay. Take it further. He says it's the absence, sin is the absence, evil is the absence of good. All right? Take it further. What do you mean? In other words, evil occurs, right? There's evil in the world right now. It's, the things that these fanatical groups are doing, that's evil. I don't understand negative reality. What do you mean by negative reality? Okay, that's not bad at all. That's nice. Darkness is the absence of light. And that's the way, those are the terms in which Abdu'l-Baha describes this. That there's no such thing as a force from which exudes evil. So the term essence and essentially are very important in the Baha'i writings. Our essence is our soul, and from the soul emanates our powers. All right? The essence of the manifestation is his soul. All right? We will never understand God. No, that's not true. What will we not understand? The essence of God. We know all about God. And we can look at the manifestation, and they emulate every quality of godliness. They are as much of God as we understand, or ever will understand. The Guardian says, even in the next world, we will understand God through the intermediaries of the manifestation. They are as much of God as we will ever know. Why? Because they perfectly reflect the attributes, all the attributes of God. So essence is a very important word. It means the essential reality of something. Not what it does, not qualities it has, but the essence, the essential reality. So when we talk about what the soul, we really don't know yet that much about the soul. We can't understand it. We just know it's a spiritual essence that emanates from God, and it's the essence of us, and it will be forever. So, the essential reality of evil is that it's simply the absence or negation of goodness, but it has results. Okay, and that's what's confusing. So in other words, an analogy I've liked to use for about 50 years now is that if you go to say, Chicoutimi, where my niece lives, north of Quebec, in the wintertime, you'd be an idiot to do it. But if you did, you'd say the absence of heat is killing. I can't stand this. This is an incredible force that's numbing my feet and my hands and so on. So how can you say that's not a force? Well, it has results. It has effects. In the same way that if a person turns away from goodness, that has an effect in the world. Going back to my Nazi analogy, okay? May not, turning away from the light causes darkness. Right? Turning away from the heat causes coldness. But there is no essence of coldness. There's no force from which emanates cold. There's a force from which emanates heat, light, positive things. So evil is essentially non-existent. But there's a term we have to use to describe what happens when someone turns away from the good. All right? Now, yes. Okay, go ahead. It's the absence of good, but it has an effect. In other words, I see what you're saying. It comes from turning away from the good. In other words, what she said was, where does evil come from then? I didn't make the cold analogy good enough, perhaps. Let's put it this way. Cold is simply the slowing down of molecular processes, right? The molecules are slowing down. What makes the molecules speed up is heat and light. All right? So you can say the only force at work is the force that causes the molecular structures to speed up. All right? But if you get away from this force, this source, it has an effect. It will kill you. So you can say, what's killing me? The absence of heat. So it has an effect, but it doesn't have an essential source. So in the same way, if you turn away, say you suddenly became corrupt, and you became a bad mother. I can't imagine it, but that's the thing. It's possible for all of us to screw up. That's what we get to later with the fear of God. What is that about? And that possibility, let's say you did it. What would be the immediate effect on your children? Suffering, they would be changed, they would be confused, they might be injured the rest of their lives, okay? So it would have an effect. But so you're right, exactly right, you put your finger on it. Evil in this sense, it only has meaning in terms of human choice and will, which emanates from the soul, where we make choices about what we will do. Okay? But the only positive force at work in the world ultimately is God, from which emanates all the rest of reality. And that's what we're going to get to later, and that is is if you understand what God really desires, then everything else has to exist. There's no other way God could have done what he wished to do than the way he has done it. Why do we have a physical body instead of going, if we're essentially spiritual in the first place, why don't we simply go directly to the spiritual world? Why do we have to go through this? Right? Because it's the best way to get the job done that God wants done, namely to create a being that has a choice and doesn't know which is the right choice until that being does what Ken is going to discuss. Attains knowledge, is attracted to what one understands, and then acts justly accordingly. Yes, I did. I just gave you a course. I'm sorry. That would be a good commonplace, and that's the presumption that the laws created by your municipality are for the public good, and we presume they are. So the traffic laws are something that were instituted by a governance that wish to make you safer. All right. So, pardon? Yes. This is where we're getting into relativism and cultural identity. So on an individual level, you can say, yes, it might be all right for a woman to be subservient to a man within a certain culture, but we're looking at it as Baha'is from an objective point of view of the latest information revealed by Baha'u'llah. And so we would say, we kind of overlook the cultural relativism of that proposition. So you can say, from the culture's point of view, yes, they define what's good and what's not good for those individuals. And you can say, as long as those individuals believe that that's good and that's true, that's fine. But you had people like Martin Luther King in this country who said, my culture says that I have to drink at a separate water fountain and that I have to go through all this raggedy process in order to get to vote. I don't find that just. Therefore, I'm going to change my culture. Now, as Baha'is, we'd say, well, yeah, in fact, a lot of Baha'is were, you saw the movie Selma, if you did. There were a lot of Baha'is who went down there to participate in that. Of course, then we get into violation of the law, civil disobedience, and we get into at least a couple of Baha'i schools worth of talk. All right, now let's do a couple of more, and then we'll get ready to go to your classes and go through these passages and try to answer them on your own. Here's an interesting thing, as if the rest of this weren't. If terms like Satan and the evil one are entirely symbolic, why are they personified so powerfully? Why are they capitalized, first of all? The evil one, you see that in the writings, you think, wait a minute, we don't believe in the evil one, but there it is, and it's in capital letters. Why is it in capital letters? That's a good answer, because it is such a powerful force, what Abdu'l-Baha calls the insistent self. It just never lets go. And you have stories of Tarazullah Samandare asking for the power, the prayer for the confirmation for obedience to the covenant be said. And the same thing for another individual. Same thing, forget who it was. But at any rate, his answer was, there's still time. I could still screw up. And that's the fear of God thing we'll get to later. But one other reason, just grammatically, yes. Say it again. Antithesis. Okay. What she's saying is, Abdul Baha says that in order to understand one thing, you have to understand its antithesis. So the way we understand good is by seeing what happens when good is disobeyed and so on, which is true, which is one thing we experience in this world. This world is, of course, I've said in a lot of my writing, is like a classroom. Why does God have us go through this process? Because He wants us to love Him through discovery and willful attraction to His reality, and we have a choice. It's the will, free will, as Abdul Baha says, is a mighty will, he calls it. One reason grammatically they're capitalized is because they're personifications. A personification in grammar should be capitalized. So if you have an abstract concept and you personify it, give it a character, so Mr. Evil is Satan, and so we capitalize it. That's why it is grammatically. But as strong and powerful as these words are used in the faith, in the writings, they always mean the same thing. And that is, we do not believe there is a source of evil. We do not believe in evil spirits. We do not believe in a Satan. Is any being or thing inherently evil or bad? Anybody? Is anyone inherently evil? No, that's right. We're all born, we're all born pure, and so on. Now, of course, the reasons we may turn bad or in the eyes of society or ourselves might not be our own fault. So again, it's a very complex thing we're dealing with this life, isn't it? Well, we've got a few more minutes. Any questions so far? In other words, the one thing we're trying to get at this part of the course, we've got 3 lessons. The first one is on guilt and what it means, the concept of sin and what it means. And then we're going to deal this afternoon with, so what do we do to improve ourselves? What is our personal IPG, we're going to call it? Intensive program of growth. And then on tomorrow morning, we're going to deal with salvation and what is salvation from a Baha'i point of view. And is there such a thing as salvation from a Baha'i point of view? Very interesting. Yes, you got a question? The intermediary, Mm-hmm. Right? I think your question is, how does God assess, or what is the ultimate result of those who commit evil acts because of a dysfunctional mind or schizophrenia and so on? And, or someone who's been raised without parenting, someone who's been deprived, someone who, for whatever reason, and again, you presume that, you don't presume that, you know that God is just. You know that God is ever forgiving. You know that God is loving. If you were an ever forgiving being, what would you do? I'm asking you, what would you do for someone who committed evil acts because they were schizophrenic? You would forgive them. All right. So again, I ask the question I always do at this point. Do you think God's less forgiving than you are? All right. So in other words, as the writings say very clearly, a child that dies before it's reached the ability to discern good and evil, or someone who diseases of mind or body do not affect the soul. Those who die before they have the ability to make such decisions. So they're cared for, they're taken care of. So in other words, if you have the opportunity in this life, use it. Because you'll be judged according to what capacities you have and opportunities you have. All right? If you don't, That's okay. There are other ways that you will progress in the next world. So those who can't have the opportunity in this life, God is just and God is loving. They'll be taken care of. But you who do, who's responsible for your spiritual development? No one is responsible for the spirituality of anybody else. Baha'u'llah says, no one's spirituality is conditioned, can be conditioned by another. Meaning, no one can become spiritual for you, and you can't become spiritual for someone else. Which makes you be in the sort of position God is in. Love me that I may love thee. If thou lovest me not, my love can't reach thee. It's there for you, but if you aren't receptive, I can't do anything about it because I've created you to have that capacity. Yes. The total that... You're just expressing a dilemma. You don't really have a specific question. Okay, so your question is, even though we're supposed to be forgiving of someone else who is iniquitous or who has a bad influence on us or our children, what is our response? And our response is that you pray for them and you hope the best for them, but you protect your children, you protect yourself. The hidden word, don't associate with the ungodly. Well, that's maybe that could be taken a little too stringently. Obviously, that's mollified according to the situation in which you find yourself. But you're supposed to defend yourself, defend your family, and so on. How you do it, their situational morality is fairly effective. It depends on the situation. It depends entirely on the situation. You have to do the best you can in any given situation. So, at what point do you say this far and no further? That's a decision you have to make on a daily basis, and it may change. Yes, ma'am. A little louder, please. You work with people? Yes. This is something, of course, and the reason I asked, still call him Counselor Gadirian because he was a counselor. The reason I asked him to write this on depression was particularly because depression still has a stigma, particularly in a religious community, that anyone who is not gleeful and happy is depressed. Why you're depressed? You're a Baha'i. You have everything you need. No, you can still get sick, you can still suffer and so on. So you're right, there's still a stigma attached to mental illness, even though we're discovering that most of it is physiologically caused, and so it's as much of a medical illness as any other medical illness. So yeah, there is that stigma, and it's alive and well in our community because we're a part of that world. Okay? Friends, thank you very much. We now we have a coffee break, right? And then we will have your